Our Bibles, please, and we're going to turn first of all to the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. Leviticus, chapter 23. Now, we started this particular study last week looking at the feasts of Israel. Now, this is, of course, we have been in this study on prophecy in the news for several months now. We're looking at different aspects of what the Bible prophesies concerning things to come. And what we have been primarily looking at over the last several weeks was the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is about a future battle that is really the most descriptive battle we find in the Scriptures, and yet it hasn't happened yet. It's an invasion by several nations, primarily Russia and Iran, which up until the 1990s had no dealings with each other. But right now are very close, and also some northern African nations, which Russia is very involved with, the different nations in Africa. So it's an amazing thing to look at those nations that Ezekiel 38-39 speaks about, and we can see those things in the news today. And it just kind of gets you wondering, how close we might be. Now, we have said that there's different scenarios for when that battle may be fought. And the scenario that we have put forward to you is the fact that we believe that it could happen between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation period. Sometimes people will associate the tribulation with the day of the Lord. And the tribulation does happen in the day of the Lord. But they're not identical. Because in 2 Peter chapter 3, the Bible says that the end of this present earth, when it's burned up and he creates a new heaven and new earth, will happen in the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord begins with the rapture, but it doesn't end with the rapture, and it doesn't actually end at all, because today is man's day. We're having our time. But God is being silent, but one day God will break the silence, and he will have his way, and he will enter into the affairs of this world in a very real supernatural manner. We believe the first thing that happens is when he comes for his bride, for the church, we're taken out of the way. And we believe that there could be a gap between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation period. And that's when the Antichrist would come to power. There's many things that would take place, but we believe this battle of Gog and Magog could take place in that gap. And this is important, the purpose of that battle, and it says it over and over again in Ezekiel, is that from that day and forward that Israel would know that I am the Lord their God. We've made the statement that only 23% of Jewish people in Israel go to synagogue, are religious Jews. Most of the Jewish people in Israel are secular Jews. They're agnostic, they're atheistic. They may have Jewish identity because of their culture and their ethnicity, but they don't believe in God, the God of the Bible. So by the end of the tribulation period, they, as a nation, will believe upon Jesus. But how are you going to get them to believe in Jesus when right now they don't even believe in God? And so God does a work in their hearts, just as in Joseph's time, before he revealed himself the second time and became their deliverer. Joseph put his brothers through a time of purging and chastening, and when they had opportunity to repent for the things that they had done, and they did so. And only when they repented did Joseph reveal himself to them. It's the same thing with Christ. He is going to work repentance in the nation of Israel during that time of tribulation period. And so the thing that starts it, how does God get their attention? How does he bring a religious belief, a religious revival on behalf of the Jewish people in their relationship with Jehovah? Well, he does it by supernaturally defending his people against this great invasion from Magog. Okay. Now, this also fits into what we're looking at right now, which is what the Bible says about the feasts of Israel. Now, we initially went through this last week, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of time on it, but you'll notice in your notes there, in Leviticus 23, these are the feasts of the Lord. And the one we're looking at in particular here is the Feast of Trumpets. get my little thingamajig here. I don't know where these go. And so that's verse 23. I want you to notice Leviticus 23, verse 23. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel. Now stop there for a moment. Who are the feasts of the Lord concerning? Israel. These are the feasts of Israel. These are the feasts of the Lord concerning the people of Israel. In the Old Testament, the church is a what? Mystery, right? Something that was not revealed. It wasn't revealed until New Testament times and really the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And so when we go through these feasts, they do apply to us in many ways because of our connection with Christ. But always keep in mind, these are concerning Israel. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month. And so the days of these feasts are really important as well, the dates. So this is the first day of the 7th month. Ye shall have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets and holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And that's all it says about the feasts of trumpets. Now, where is this? I've lost my wee clicker here. I don't know where it is. Baptist pulpits are a bottomless pit. You lose all kinds of things. Okay, so this is a kind of different chart than we had last time. Thank you, guys. They're all waving at me. Is it on now? Is it on now? It's on now? Yeah? Okay. All right. So this is the Gregorian Roman calendar, the solar calendar that we're on. This is the lunar calendar, that is the Jewish calendar. So they have different names for their months. And we saw that the first of the feasts is the Feast of Passover. And that happens on the 14th of Nisan, which corresponds to our March-April time. Followed by the next day, the 15th, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it lasts for 7 days. It's a week-long feast. Then after that, there's the Feast of First Fruits. Now, the Feast of First Fruits is not on a date. It's on a day. And it's the first day after the Sabbath of Passover week. So the Sabbath will move. The dates are fixed, but the weekday will move on the calendar. It's just the way it happens. And so whatever that first day is after the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath of Passover, that's the Feast of First Fruits. And I won't go into all the details because it'll just take too long. Then 50 days after First Fruits is the Feast of Pentecost. That's what Pentecost means. It means 50. And Pentecost, and of course, these have spiritual significance. Christ is our Passover. He's the Passover lamb. When I see the blood, I'll pass over you. Unleavened bread. So this is salvation. This is justification. This would represent sanctification. Leaven is sin. Unleavened bread. They're getting the bread, the unleavened, the leaven out of their houses, because during the Passover, the first Passover, the Exodus, they bake unleavened bread for the journey, because unleavened bread will last longer. There's no yeast in it, no leaven in it. So that typifies, and it's you're saved in one day. You're saved by the blood of the Lamb. But then getting the leaven out of your life is a process. So it's a 7-day feast. It's a longer time. First fruits is speaking about the resurrection. That's when Jesus was resurrected. And he's the first fruits because where the rest of that harvest is coming later. Pentecost is also about harvest. That's about the wheat, the barley harvest. This is about the wheat harvest. And the two wheat loaves that had leaven baked into them, symbolizing sin, speaking about people. And those two loaves represent something that happened new on Pentecost. The fulfillment of the Feast of Pentecost was Jew and Gentile together. Now again, he still doesn't make, they're waved together, but he doesn't mention the church, although we believe the church started on the day of Pentecost. But because the feasts are Jewish, Jew and Gentile, one body that he doesn't talk about as far as the Feast of Pentecost is concerned. Now, there's a long period of time, I think it's 117 days, until the first day of Tishri. The first day of the 7th month, that's what we're looking at tonight, is the Feast of Trumpets. It happens on the first day of the 7th month. On the 10th day of the 7th month is Yom Kippur, which is the 6th feast, which is the Feast of Atonement. And then the last feast is also a week-long feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And so we're going to look at what trumpet means tonight. Of course, the Day of Atonement, again, speaking about Israel, is when Jesus comes back and there comes out of Zion a Redeemer, a Deliverer for the the people of Israel. And that's when the Jewish people as a nation receive the atonement for their sin for all time, when Jesus applies his blood to them. And then after that, tabernacles represents what happens after that. This is after the second coming. He deals with their sin, and then he establishes his kingdom, and it's a time of great joy, fulfillment, rest, and it really typifies the whole millennial kingdom, the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, all these feasts are really kind of easy to understand as far as their fulfillment, except this one, trumpets. This is what they call, both by the church and also Jewish interpreters, they call this the mystery feast because they have no idea what it means. So let's go ahead and look at two things that it doesn't mean. Okay, so let's look at our notes here. The fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets. There are two common misconceptions about the meaning of the Feast of Trumpets. One is held by Christians and the other is held by Jews. The first one is the rapture. People think because 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 talks about, the shout of the archangel with the trump of God, the last trump will all be changed, will be caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. So it has to do with trumpets. So obviously it has to do with the Feast of Trumpets. The problem with that is that the rapture has to do with who? The church. The church is not Israel. The feasts have to do with who? Israel. Israel is not the church. These are the feasts of Israel. So the rapture is not in view here. Just as, this has nothing to do with us as far as Israel is concerned. You say, now, well, these apply to us too because Christ is our Passover. It has to do with our relationship with Christ. But notice that these are given to the nation of Israel. That's the primary interpretation that we must adopt. The second misconception held by Jews is that this is the Jewish New Year. And of course, in our calendar today, it is the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh means the head or the prince or the first, Rosh Hashanah, the year. It means the head of the year. It means the first of the year. It's the Jewish New Year. And it's kind of interesting that it happens right across from Nisan. See that? Tishri is actually the 7th month. So you got 6 months here. And then the last half of the year, you get into Tishri. Now, before the Babylonian captivity, this was, the Jewish people never had a New Year's other than this one. Because in Exodus chapter 12, just go ahead and turn there, Exodus chapter 12, in verse 1 and 2. And of course, this is the first feast, the Feast of Passover, is in Exodus chapter 12. But he tells you in verses 1 and 2, the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month, what month? The month of Nisan, shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So God tells us in the Word of God, both us and the Jewish people, that the month of Nisan, which is our March-April time, is the first month. This is the first month. What is Tishri? It's the 7th month. How can you have the 7th month as the first of the year? It's impossible. January is the first year for us on our calendar, right? You can't say, well, July is the beginning of our year. No, January is the beginning of our year. It's the first month. God says Nisan is the first month. So how come they're saying Tishri is the first month? It was a tradition that came about after the Babylonian captivity. You can't get it any further back than that. It's something that they made up. One of the reasons I think they made it up is because they don't know what trumpets is all about. So they basically made it Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. But that's not biblical and it's not scriptural. And so we want to know, what is the scriptural meaning of the Feast of Trumpets? So the Feast of Trumpets is not about the rapture, and it's not about the Jewish New Year. So what is it? What is it about then? Well, if you notice your scriptures again, Leviticus chapter 23. And let me just throw this up too. You have this from last week. But these are the 7 feasts basically strung out along a prophetic timeline. Now, can this be challenged? Of course it can be challenged. Is this absolutely true? Well, I think it's true, but it's open to challenge, and that's, if you got a better idea, then we're all ears. And so we got to compare Scripture with Scripture. If this is not accurate, we want what is accurate. But we've been studying it for a long time, and we've been looking at all the questions and different answers, and I think this is pretty accurate. So the first 4 feasts have already been fulfilled. Okay? The last 3 feasts have yet to be fulfilled. The question is, when are they going to be fulfilled? Well, Tabernacles is easy because that has to do with the kingdom. The fruit is in the barn. It's a feast of rest. It's a feast of joy. It's a wonderful time of rejoicing. Before that happens the atonement. We talked about that in Leviticus 23. In Leviticus 23, they were not to do anything, no work at all. They were to do no servile work therein. And because atonement has nothing to do with our works, it has everything to do with the blood of the Lamb. Amen. And Jesus is that Lamb. Now, where do we put the Feast of Trumpets? Okay, so this is a heads up. We believe the rapture happens. It's the first thing that happens in the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. There's no warnings. There's no fulfilled prophecies before that happens. So it's a surprise. That's what the rapture is. It's a surprise. If you have the rapture somewhere in here, it's not a surprise because you've got all these different things happening. The day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. And it doesn't end. So the rapture begins that, a supernatural time of God's intervention in the history of people. We believe there could be a gap in here. Just as there was a gap in here between God finishing with Israel before the church began. There was a gap, didn't overlap. And yet some prophecies with Israel overlapped into the church age. Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed, not one stone upon it. That happened in 70 AD. That was after the church had started. So some of that bleeds in here. Some of this bleeds in over here because the regathering of the Jewish people, I think, is a prophecy that has been fulfilled in May 1948. So some of those things are bleeding over into the church age. And I think maybe before we finish this series, we'll do some messages on the signs of the times. Things that the Bible speaks about in the Old Testament concerning the latter days that we are seeing in our time. For example, in Daniel chapter 12, it says that many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. I think that's speaking about travel and knowledge. So you go back 100 years ago, and hardly anybody went, more than 20 miles from where the place they were born. But that's not true today. You go through Heathrow and Gatwick and JFK, and you see people from all over the world. I mean, third world countries. They know what it is to fly around all over the world. Many shall run to and fro. Knowledge shall be increased. The digital age. It's an amazing thing that has taken place in our lifetime with the knowledge being increased. So there's signs like that we can look at that I think are taking place in this time. But it's in preparation for this period of time, Daniel's 70th week, what we call the tribulation. Now we believe, and again, I'm telling you this is Fittisology to some extent. This can be challenged. Not every good, solid Bible teacher believes what I'm telling you. But I'm putting forth a scenario that answers a lot of questions. That there's a battle between Gog and Magog and that invasion with Israel. Because we're already in the day of the Lord, because supernatural things have already happened with the rapture, God is free to enter into the affairs of men, bring fire from heaven, do supernatural things like he did in the Old Testament. You don't have that now, but in the day of the Lord, those things are going to happen. Right now, God is silent, but in the day of the Lord, he speaks and speaks very loudly. And so we believe that the purpose of the Battle of Gog and Magog was to get the Jewish people's attention. And really to turn them back, to get them to believe. I mean, how can you deny this? In fact, in Ezekiel, and I have the verses there, and we looked at it the last few weeks, but in Ezekiel chapter 39, and I think I have the reference down there somewhere. Anyway, I'll get to it here in just a second. But it basically mentions how that God reveals himself, not just to the Jewish people, but also to all the nations of the earth. They can't deny this, that this is supernaturally from God. And it really gets their attention. But this fits in with the Feast of Trumpets. Because the Feast of Trumpets, the way we understand it, well, let's go ahead. We just have to look at these verses and glean from it. Okay, so first of all, it's called the Feast of Trumpets. In verse 24, it should be a memorial, a blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. Now, the significance of trumpets, and this is the trumpet, it's the shofar. And I had one on my shelf today, and I was going to bring it in and play it for you. I'm glad I forgot, to be honest. You're probably glad I forgot too. So the shofar, it's not like a brass trumpet. The shofar is a ram's horn. I have one that's about this long, but it actually does make sound. But one like this here makes a lot of sound. This is the shofar, and was to be blown on this day, this first day of the 7th month. Now, the shofar has significance because it's used to communicate to an army or to a people. For example, look at 1 Corinthians 14 and verse number 8. And of course, Jesus talked about this as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, please, first of all. And this is Paul speaking about tongues and being able to understand the distinction of language and so on. And so if you come down to verse number 8, he says, "For if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to battle?" So these were used in the army because, you've got a bunch of people fighting. You're not going to hear the sergeant over here giving you an order. You got to have something that's really loud that goes above the whole din of men at war. But it's also used to call people to action. For example, in Matthew 6 verse 2, do you remember the hypocrites, the Pharisees would go with a trumpet onto the street corner and they would blow the trumpet, and they're saying, "We want the pure people to know that we're here giving out alms." And Jesus said, "No, you're doing it for a fanfare, to be seen of people. You're making a big deal, a big show. You wouldn't go to those people individually and hand them some money because there wouldn't be any reward in it for you, because you want to see admiration from people. And so you blow the trumpet, and it's a sign, it's a sound, so that the people know to be gathered together. And so the trumpet is used for gathering people. In fact, that's what we find here in Leviticus 23, because he says, "Ye shall have a Sabbath, a memorial blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation." Now, the word convocation there means gathering. In fact, all the feasts were gatherings. 3 of the feasts were pilgrimage gatherings. Feast of Passover, Feast of Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles, where the people had to come to Jerusalem. Every meal had to come to Jerusalem for those feasts. That's when Jesus was a wee boy. His mum and daddy came from Nazareth, brought Jesus with him to the Feast of Passover, pilgrimage feast. But the idea is that the trumpet is blown and the people are gathered, and there's this gathering together. And so that's where the trumpets come in. Then there's a significance of a memorial. In verse 24, he says, "A memorial of blowing of trumpets." Now, again, many of the feasts are remembrances, memorials. The feast of Passover they were to remember God's deliverance out of Egypt. And you remember Jesus established the Lord's Supper at the Passover, and he said, "This do in remembrance of me." So we're to remember our deliverance through the blood of the Lamb, through Christ. The Jewish people were to remember God's deliverance through the Passover from the hand of Pharaoh, and so on. So the Feast of Passover is about remembering things. Then the Feast of Tabernacles is actually a remembrance as well, because the Feast of Tabernacles is called the Feast of Booths. And what they were instructed to do for that whole week in Tishri, between the 15th and the 22nd, they were to vacate their homes. Now, their barns were full, but their houses were empty, because God instructed them to make little booths or tabernacles on the side of their house. And so they would move everybody out, the kids out of their bedrooms, and they would sleep in this little tabernacle, this little hut, for a period of 7 days. What was God doing? He was helping them to remember the Exodus, how that they didn't have homes, didn't have land. They were basically wandering for 40 years, and the only thing they had was God. And there was two object lessons that God gave during the time of tabernacles. In the court of the temple, there were 4 large candelabra that were lit, and that was to represent the fire by night and the cloud by day, which represent the presence of God. So they didn't have their homes, they didn't have land, and they're living in a hut, living in a tent, tabernacle, but what they did have was God. And the other symbol was, on the last day of the feast, they would have what they call the water libations. And so they would go from the Temple Mount, the priest would, down to the pool of Siloam, at the bottom. And if you've ever been there, it's amazing because it's still there. And they just excavated it just a few years ago. But what they would do is they would go down to the pool of Siloam and they would pick silver pitchers and they would take water and they would go up to the Temple Mount and they would pour it out as a water libation. Now that reminded them of Christ, the rock. Well, remember on the rock that God opened up and the rivers of water gushed out, that God provided rivers, streams in the desert, in the wilderness. And it's very interesting because at that feast, in John chapter 9, Jesus met a man who was born blind. And he spat on the ground and made clay, the spittle, and he anointed the man's eyes. The man must have been somewhat believing, at least humble at that time. Would you like a stranger put dirt in your eyes? Well, that's what he let Jesus do. And then Jesus said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And he went, it's a long way down, by the way. The man had enough faith in what Jesus said, and he went all the way down as a blind man, down all those steps, got into the pool of Siloam, and he put the water on his eyes. And when he washed in the water, the light came in for the first time, proving that Jesus is the light of the world and the water of life. And Jesus is the fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. I forgot why I got on that. But anyway, remembrances. Okay, so there's different feasts that remember different things. Okay, now, what is Tabernacle supposed to remind us of? This stumps us because we don't know until we start really digging in and studying the Scriptures. Now, the other thing here in verse 25, which is what the slide is about, he says, you shall do no servile work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. This feast also has to do with an offering. There has to be a burnt offering that is offered on an altar. Now, here's an altar in Engedi. These are like from biblical times. There was probably just some stairs here that are knocked away. And this is, no cut stones. Remember, they told them no cut stones. And this is where they would have burnt the sacrifices, okay? And so the place for that really, though, of course, is Jerusalem, because God chose Jerusalem as the place for the temple and the place for sacrifice. And of course, that's where Jesus was sacrificed as well. That's where Isaac was sacrificed, on one of the mountains that I will tell thee of, in the land of Moriah. So it has to do with trumpets, it has to do with remembering something, it has to do with sacrifice, but the most significant thing, and this is the key to this whole thing, is the timing. And the timing is that it happens on the first day of the 7th month. So here's what you have to do in order to figure this thing out, because it is a puzzle, it's a mystery. What we find when we study the Bible is He's a God of patterns. Now, you know that we like this at our church because we believe that Christ is all through the Old Testament. When the apostles preached Jesus, they didn't have a New Testament, they had the Old Testament. And so they preached Christ out of the Old Testament. How is that possible? The Old Testament's finished 400 years BC. Because God is the author of the Old Testament and He's painting pictures, He's giving prophecies, He gives types. These feasts are types. Passover is a type. First fruits is a type. And so God builds pictures in the Old Testament, but He expects us to study it and to read it and to compare spiritual things with spiritual, compare scriptures with scriptures, and look at the pattern. So what we have here when we study the Bible, and this is the key is the first day of the 7th month. And so we basically ask the question, well, what happened in the Old Testament on the first day of the 7th month? Was there anything that ever happened on the first day of the 7th month? And there was. So these are, in a sense, historical precedents. Here God is building a picture of things in the Old Testament in the past, because these Old Testament things are actually pointing forward. Now, Passover, in a sense, was looking back to the first Passover, and Christ is the fulfillment of the first Passover. These Old Testament precedents are actually looking forward to the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets. So what exactly is it about? Okay, well, we're just going to look at what the Bible says here. So first of all, the first historical precedent we find in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. So let's go ahead and look there. 2 Chronicles chapter number 5. And what you'll find is that there's a theme here. When God is building this picture, when he's establishing a pattern, patterns have similar things, right? When you look at a pattern, there's a pattern. There's similar things that go together. And that's what we find when we look at these historical precedents. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 5, you're going to find that this is when Solomon, the son of David, has built the first ever temple. Before this time, from the time they were on Mount Sinai, when God gave the law to Moses, and he gave all the instructions in the book of Exodus concerning the tabernacle, which is a very detailed building with all the furniture and all the things surrounding that, and the priesthood. And so the tabernacle was brought by Joshua into the promised land, and it remained at Shiloh, which is north of Jerusalem. And David wanted to bring he wanted to build a temple. God says you can't do it because you got blood on your hands. But eventually it was brought to Mount Zion. And only when Solomon got the temple finished did they bring the Ark of the Covenant right into the Holy of Holies. And this is when it happened. And this is when Solomon dedicated the temple for the very first time. Guess when it happened? The first day of the 7th month. Now, the 7th month has 3 feasts. It has Trumpets, it has Atonement, and it has Tabernacles. And Solomon really just wrapped all those feasts up together in the first 23 days. And for the first 23 days of the 7th month, they were doing all these things. So let's look at 2 Chronicles 5, verses 1 to 3. Thus all the work that Solomon made for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in all the things that David his father had dedicated, and the silver and the gold, and all the instruments put he among the treasures of the house of God. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, and all the heads of the tribes, and the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto Jerusalem. Now that's another important thing, because these feasts happen where? All of them, where do they happen? Jerusalem. It's always about Jerusalem. And so all the top brass are now being called by Solomon to Jerusalem. All the 12 tribes are gathered to Jerusalem. And then it says, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. Wherefore all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto the king in the feast. Now the difficulty is he doesn't mention which feast. But understand, this is the initial gathering of the people together unto the king in the feast, which was in the 7th month. Okay, because it's one of those 3 feasts. Trumpets, Yom Kippur, or Tabernacles. Now, the reason I believe this is the first day, the reason I believe this is the Feast of Trumpets that he's talking about here, is because, and you can read through these next chapters, but when you go to chapter 7, all the way to chapter 7, there's lots of things going on. Did you know in chapter 5 it says that they brought up the Ark of the Covenant? There, down in verse 6, and also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him before the ark, sacrificed sheep and oxen which could not be told nor numbered for multitude. Now that's interesting because it happens again later, but then it is numbered. When you come over to chapter 7, verse 5, the King Solomon offered sacrifice, 20 and 2,000 oxen and 120. But that's a lot of animals. Do you know what happens? You know he basically tells you that he takes the whole inner court and he makes that the altar. In the inner court, you had the brazen altar, which is quite a big thing, and they sacrifice lots of animals on that. But there were so many sacrifices, the altar was overrun. So he just made the inner court the whole altar, and they sacrificed thousands and thousands of animals. I mean, it just boggles the mind. 22,000 oxen. I mean, that's a big animal. 22,000 of them. 120,000 sheep. And so the king and all the people dedicated the house of God. So this is a big deal. It's a big party. It's a big ceremony when Solomon is dedicating the temple to God. Now, when you come down, and so what I'm saying is in chapter 5, they didn't even number the sacrifices. But when you get to chapter 7, it's a different thing. It's a different time, actually. And then when you come down to verse 8, it says of chapter 7, he says, also at that time Solomon kept the feast 7 days. And all Israel with him, a very great congregation, from the entering of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. And And by the way, there's another passage for this, 1 Kings chapter 8. You compare some of those things. And it's actually put 7 days and 7 days. It's a 14-day feast, which is longer. But what he's saying, though, the point I'm making, though, is verse 8. At that time, Solomon kept the feast. Well, they've already been there. They came on the feast. What do you mean? You're keeping the feast now, but you've been here for 2 weeks. Then they came at the feast. Well, what feast was it? It was when they first gathered, when they first came, it was the Feast of Trumpets. They blew the trumpets and the people were gathered, a holy convocation for a very special time. Now, even if you don't get all of that, basically what I'm saying is the Bible associates the temple and the sacrificial system with the 7th month, and I think the first day of the month. And this has a bearing on what the Feast of Trumpets is all about and what they were to remember. The second historical precedent is in Ezra chapter 3. So let's go ahead and look there in Ezra chapter number 3. Now, and so, this slide is about the dedication of the temple. By the way, it's an interesting thing here. I'll just turn this out for a second. This is an artist's rendition of this. Of course, it was much different than that. But I want you to notice this here. Solomon actually built like a pulpit in that inner court, so that he was above all the people, and people could see him kneeling down, getting on his face before God, and they could also hear his prayer. And it was a wonderful prayer, a marvelous prayer. And here there was 120 priests that were there. I want you to notice this. Now, the artist hasn't heard my sermon, before this, but I want you to notice the trumpets. And of course, this is silver trumpets, which they didn't have. They would have had the show first. But on this first day of the 7th month, they were blowing the trumpets. And this was something done where he was above the people and they could see him. Now that's interesting because when we get to Nehemiah, I just want you to hold that thought. Okay, so let's go then to Ezra chapter 3 and verse 1. Now Ezra chapter 3, this is about the return after the Babylonian captivity. So you had first of all Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel was before Ezra, although Ezra is writing about Zerubbabel. In fact, if you look at this one here, where is it? Okay. So here you have Zerubbabel returns, and what does Zerubbabel do? He builds the temple. That's 537. Ezra comes along toward the end of this, 540 or 458. Ezra returns, and the law is taught. So Zerubbabel builds the temple, Ezra builds the people, and Nehemiah builds the walls. But I want you to know there's 94 years between what Zerubbabel does on the first day of the 7th month and what Nehemiah does on the first day of the 7th month. There is a tie. It's the date, the first day of the 7th month, but there's 94 years between them. Now, in Ezra chapter 1, look at verse 1. And when the 7th month was come, and the children of Israel were in the cities. Let me just back this up here a bit. The people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. So there's the gathering. And it's in the 7th month. Now, it doesn't say it's the first day there, but if you go over to verse 6, it says, from the first day of the 7th month began they to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. But the first thing I want to show you is on the first day, so it is on the first day of the 7th month here. It's in the 7th month, okay, so it has to be at least the first day, right? When they came to Jerusalem. What is this? They're keeping the Feast of Trumpets. They're coming to Jerusalem. They're a holy convocation. The trumpets are being blown, and Israel, who have come out of Babylon, have returned to the land. They're in the cities, and now they're all coming out of the cities, and they're coming to Jerusalem. So the second historical precedent is the return to Jerusalem. Now again, these are patterns, and the fulfillment will reflect all of these things as well. And let me just go on here. All right. Let's go quickly to the next historical precedent, which is in Ezra chapter 3, verse 2 and 3. Then stood up Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, builded the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. And they set the altar upon his basis, for fear was upon them because of the people of those countries. And they offered burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord, even burnt offerings morning and evening. That was the first time that happened in over 70 years. Because even before the temple was destroyed, they were in idolatry, and it was just a disaster. And that's why God judged them. But Nebuchadnezzar went into Jerusalem. I think 586 is when he actually destroyed the temple, burned it with fire. And so when these people came back 70 years later, it was just, there was nothing there. And so now they're back in their land. They're back in Jerusalem. No walls yet. That's going to happen 95 years later with Nehemiah. But the first priority was the temple, the temple, the temple. And you know the story, how that the old men, they wept. Because when this new, when the second temple, when Solomon's temple was rebuilt, which is the second temple, Solomon's was the first temple, second temple is the temple of the restoration. It was just a pale shadow of what Solomon's was. So the old people who remembered Solomon's temple were crying their eyes out of disappointment. But the young people, they had never known Solomon's temple, and they said, "We got our temple back," and they were crying for joy. But before the temple was built, the thing that happened on the first day of the 7th month was that they offered sacrifices. You see, you don't have a temple. You don't have to have a temple to have an altar. Here's what's left of Solomon's. It didn't probably look that good. These are just artist renderings, of course. Notice, by the way, our artist somehow understands that we got trumpets blowing again. I don't know how you do that, but so they rebuilt an altar, and it wasn't that grand, I'm sure. It was probably something like we saw before. And before the temple was begun to be rebuilt, on the first day of the 7th month, they offered sacrifices to the God of Israel. First time that happened in years. And not only that, I just noticed this as we were reading verse 3. It says, "For the fear was upon them because of the people of whose countries." In other words, they were still outnumbered by the Samaritans and the people who were in the land. They were coming back to their own country, but they were still harassed. And this would have been something that was really a big deal for the foreign, their enemies, that Israel's back and they're sacrificing. Now again, what I'm going to is, what is it if Israel was to go up on the Temple Mount tonight and start to worship by having sacrifices up there? You know, right now tonight, they're not even allowed, most of them are not even allowed to go up there. Jews are not allowed up on the Temple Mount. When I was there, they weren't allowed up there. That's only come about in the last few years. And I told you before, when I was there, they told us, do not be praying. Don't be going up there and bowing your head in prayers. That's a Muslim shrine. That's a Muslim site. And they're going to kick you out. And so Jewish people right now tonight are forbidden to pray on the Temple Mount. How in the world are they going to offer sacrifice up there? And not only that, but there has to be a temple that is built there. Malachi chapter 3, the Lord shall come to his temple. Revelation chapter 11, go and measure the temple. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that the Antichrist will go into the holy place, the abomination of desolation. You can't have abomination of desolation if there's a temple there, and there's no temple there tonight. There must be one. How does it happen? Because there's a battle when most of these Muslim nations, Iran, Libya, Sudan, Russia, comes against Israel to destroy her, and God destroys them, giving Israel the upper hand. Every wall in Jerusalem falls flat, which includes the Dome of the Rock, the shrine of the Dome of the Rock. And the Muslim God is vanquished, and Allah, his name is gone, and the name of Jehovah is exalted, and the nations of the earth see that, and more importantly, Israel sees that, and it sparks an unbelievable religious revival, which fulfills the Feast of Trumpets and the beginning of a sacrificial system. Let's look at the next historical precedent, number 4. Now we find this in verse 6 and 7. It says, "From the first day of the 7th month began they to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord." Now, by the way, it always happens on this day. Do you think that the future fulfillment will happen actually right on that day? Well, what about the Passover? The Passover was to be held on the 14th of Nisan. When did Jesus, the Passover lamb, die? He died on the Passover, the 14th of Nisan. And by the way, if the Feast of Trumpets is the rapture, then you would know when he's coming, because he's going to come on the first day of the 7th month. The fulfillment of these things don't happen on any other day. They happen on the day. The question is what year? But you see, if the rapture takes place and the Battle of Gog and Magog is taking place and Israel has a revival in their faith in Jehovah again, and they start to remember, and they'll be going back to these things. And they'll be remembering their God and their history, and they'll be remembering the Bible and what the Bible says in the Torah concerning how they were to worship God, which is a whole sacrificial system, and they don't have any sacrifices. And you know what? I think when they're called to gather with the trumpets, by the way, the word trumpets, it's the blowing of trumpets, and it's actually a call to war. And it could be that the Jewish people are coming to Jerusalem and saying, you know what? God has delivered us. And they may think they're going to go to war, because I'll tell you what they're going to go to war over. We're going to have our temple. And we may have to fight everybody for it. And then the Antichrist comes on the scene and says, you know what, don't get excited. We understand. Tell you what we'll do. Let's have a 7-year treaty about all of this. Because in Daniel chapter 9, it's always talking about a peace treaty. It doesn't actually mention a peace treaty. It mentions a covenant that he sets up for 1 week or one period of 7 years. And in the midst of that week, he breaks the covenant. How does he break the covenant? He causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease. That's what the covenant is. It's a green light from the European community and the nations of the world that Israel, it's okay. We understand. You go ahead and build your temple if you want to. That's what the covenant is. Well, let's look at the last historical precedent in Nehemiah. So go forward to Nehemiah chapter 8. So we have the dedication and the initial offerings, the blood sacrifices in Solomon's temple that began on the first day of the 7th month. After the Babylonian captivity, they came back and they came into Jerusalem on the first day of the 7th month. And when they got there on the first day of the 7th month, they immediately erected an altar and started making sacrifices on that altar. And so after all those years of disuse, the sacrificial system was back in order. And then, you know what, I didn't read the one. Let's go back. I apologize. Keep your place there in Nehemiah. I turned to the scripture and I didn't read it. Because the fourth historical precedent is the beginning to rebuild the temple. And you'll get that. I read verse 6, but look at verse 7. They gave money. In fact, the last part of verse 6 says, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So they sacrificed without a temple. They just threw some stones together, made an altar, and started sacrificing animals. Didn't have a temple yet. But that was the first day of the 7th month. And you know what also happened on the first day of the 7th month? Verse 7. They gave money also unto the masons and to the carpenters, and meat and drink and oil unto them of Zion, and to them of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon and the sea of Joppa, according to the grant that they had of Cyrus king of Persia. You see, you'll read about that in chapter 2, verse 68 and so on. So when they came to Jerusalem, they already had stuff. But on the first day of the 7th month, they began to sacrifice. First of all, they came to Jerusalem, they began to sacrifice. And number 3, they said, here's the money, build your temple. And that was initiated on the first day of the 7th month. Now, obviously, it took several years for that to happen. But the decision was made, and people put their money where their mouth was on the first day of the 7th month. So, beginning of rebuilding of the temple. Then the fifth historical precedent, we go back to Nehemiah chapter 8. This is wonderful. Verses 1 through 3, first of all. And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street. Now, this is 94 years after Zerubbabel. But it's still the first day of the 7th month. And they gather as one man into the street that was before the water gate, that's Jerusalem. And they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. So now you have Ezra. Ezra is a priest. He's a scribe. And he knows the Bible. And they don't know the Bible. Just like Jews today don't know the Bible. They're secular. Verse 2. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and of women, and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. And he read therein before the street that was before the water gate from the morning until midday. before the men and the women and those that could understand, and the ear of all the people were attentive unto the law, the book of the law. By the way, when Nehemiah, when Ezra, Nehemiah's there too, but when Ezra stands up and there's like, I think 6 men on one side, 7 men on the other side, they built a what? A pulpit of wood. Why do we have a pulpit of wood? It actually goes back to Nehemiah. And the synagogues took their pattern off this. And so the pulpit is always in the middle. Nehemiah, Ezra had 6 men on one side, 7 men on the other side. So the pulpit, the reader's always in the middle. Okay? There he is. And he's reading the scriptures. What day? First day of the 7th month. What is the effect of that? Look down at verse number 8. So they read in the book of the law of God distinctly and gave the sense. By the way, that's what preaching is all about, really. It's not about funny stories and, what happened in the Southern Standard this week. No, you're preaching the Bible. You're helping people to understand it. You're reading it distinctly, giving the sense, and cause them to understand the reading. Verse 9. And Nehemiah, which is the Tishri, like the mayor, the governor, and Ezra the priest, the scribe, and the Levites that taught the people, said unto all the people, This day is holy unto the Lord your God. Mourn not nor weep, for all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Now I'll tell you what happened there. They had revival. You read chapter 8, you find out these people had no idea what the law said. No, they had never heard it before. And first of all, they were convicted about their disobedience and their ignorance of the words of God. And they had to come along and comfort them and say, this is a special day. This is the Feast of Trumpets. And this is a day of rejoicing. And he encouraged the people. But they got right. And they were there was a spiritual revival that took place on the first day of the 7th month. Now, when we put all these things together, the ultimate fulfillment of these precedents is there's going to come a day. It will be the first day of the 7th month. Now, maybe in today's culture, they say, this is our new year. This is our new year. So we're going to start the new year right. God has done all these things for us, and we're coming together like an army. And no matter what the world says, we are going to have our temple on the Temple Mount, and we are going to sacrifice, and we don't care what anybody says. Because we know that God is our God. When they were secular and they didn't believe, but now they believe. How are you going to get them to believe in Jesus when they don't now believe in God? But God's going to help them to believe in God. And when you put all these things together, I think this scenario fits. There's no other explanation for the Feast of Trumpets. And so what we find here is that this is what starts the Feast of Trumpets and the whole idea of a sacrificial system. And that's the thing that the Antichrist promises them that they can have without any flack from the rest of the international community. Could you imagine what that would bring right now if Bibi Netanyahu goes up to the UN, says, guess what, we want to build our temple on the Temple Mount. Are you joking? World War III. But what happens if we have World War III first? And God wins, and Israel wins, and they have a high hand. We always think the Antichrist, this covenant, this peace treaty or whatever, that he's kind of doing Israel a favour. Well, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe he realises that God is real and people know it, and he's kind of just going along with it. And that's why they have that treaty. So all these events foreshadow a future day which will be fulfilled on the first day of the 7th month, a day when the Jewish people will be assembled in Jerusalem. This is the epicenter of the world. That's the Muslim shrine. It's not a mosque, it's a shrine. It's supposed to be where Muhammad went to heaven. It's the third most holy site in Islam. This is the Alaska Mosque here. Over here is the Western Plaza. This is the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. You see, that's a ramp that they come up to get in here. If you're going there as a tourist, you'll come up this ramp to come onto the Temple Mount. And you can walk all around here. There's the Eastern Gate over here where Jesus will come through. But he will come to his temple. There's not a temple there right now. And so in that day, the Jews will come to Jerusalem by their millions. And they will demand that they're able to worship their God again. Again, the Western Wall. So this is the temple. This is the foundation stones of the temple of Herod's time, of the time of Jesus. He said not one stone would be left upon another. Where the temple was would be thrown down. If you walk down this street right here, that street right there, this is the Western Wall. If you come down here to the bottom corner, you'll see lots of these stones are still lying there. It's an amazing thing. Concrete, or the Roman pavement, broken by these massive walls that are thrown off the Temple Mount. So here's the Jews. And where are they? Why are they at the Western Wall? Why are they at the Western Wall? Because what's on the other side of that? It's their most holiest place. It's where the temple would sit. But right now, today, they are blocked. They're not allowed up there. And that is going to change. And I think it's the battle of Gog and Magog that makes that happen. Here's a Jewish man with a shofar. And they're going to be there. And they'll be blowing the shofars. And it'll be a time of religious zeal. And there'll be zealots. Now, there's zealots today. We'll show you here in just a moment. But as I said last time, that's just the pilot light. This is the gas that comes in that blows the whole thing up, where they go ahead and do their build their temple. Now, the pilot light's this guy here, the Temple Institute. And they have made all the vessels for the temple. Here's a picture of that's a picture of actually Herod's temple, but they're looking at what they call the third temple. You notice the crane? They're going to build the third temple. That's already a sentiment with many, many conservative Jews in Jerusalem and Israel. But they don't have the political support to do anything until what we're talking about happens. Then the whole nation comes together and they're saying, hey guys, we got all the materials. We got the koina. We've trained the priests already. We've already got the red heifers. You sent me a video of that there this week. I should have brought that. Where the red heifer, where the sacrifice of the red heifer was the only thing that could cleanse and make the koina and the priesthood cleanse for service. Red heifer. No black hairs, no white hairs. They didn't have her for years and years and years. They just sent 6 or 7 of them to Israel. It's amazing that's happening in your lifetime. And so there they are. And what are they going to do? They're going to reestablish the sacrifice. These are the kohanim. We showed a video of it last week. And they've already been trained about how to offer the offerings. They went through the Torah and through all probably the Mishnahs as well, and finding out about how the priesthood offered the sacrifices in a legitimate sacrificial system, remembering their past. It's a memorial of who they were and what they did and what happened on the first day of the 7th month. And it's going to be a revival of the Jewish religion among the Jews. The Feast of Trumpets. Now, I think that's an amazing thing. How that the prophecies with Ezekiel 38 and 39 and what the purpose of the promise was, that they would know God. And because God has supernaturally delivered them and nobody could deny it, everybody in the world sees it, and all of a sudden the Jewish people start believing in God. Now, there's some... I've got to finish here, but look at the second of the last paragraph there. And look over at 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Now, this is a verse we all know well. And we always apply this to America or other Christian nations. But you know what it really applies to? Israel. Because 2 Chronicles chapter 7 is the dedication of the temple. And this is part of the prayer. In fact, if you read chapter 5, 6, and 7 of this, and the prayer of Solomon, basically what he's reminding God about is that there shall not fail thee a man to sit upon the throne of Israel. There's 2 things I think have happened here. One is this religious revival is a partial fulfillment of 2 Chronicles 7 verse 14. Where it says, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now their land will not be healed and their sin will not be forgiven until Yom Kippur, until Jesus Christ comes and they believe upon him and receive him as their Savior. But this is the turning. It's just like Joseph with his brothers. It didn't happen in one. Now it did happen when he says, it's me, it's Joseph. But there's lots of things that happened up to that point when Joseph was working repentance in Judah and his other brothers. But then it got to that point where Judah confessed and Joseph says, it's me. And he became their deliverer. And so there's a process going on during the tribulation period. And by the way, in the first half of the tribulation, I think that's when the two prophets come up. That you'll read about in Revelation chapter 11, which we'll get to in our series on Revelation, which I believe is Moses and Elijah. One's definitely Elijah. Look at Malachi chapter 4. And so Elijah's coming. Elijah's minister's not over. What's he going to do? He's going to turn the hearts of the Israeli people to God. Not to Baal, not to anybody else, but to the true God. That's also in that first half of the tribulations, where you have the 144,000 Jewish male unmarried men who are their witnesses. That happens in the first. And I think by the time you get to the middle of the tribulation period, there's a lot of Jews that are already saved. They've already trusted Christ. And I think that's who Jesus is speaking to in Matthew 24. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, get out of Dodge, because he's coming after you like a flood. And I think he's speaking to people who have professed, who have the testimony of Christ. And again, if you look at Revelation chapter 12, where God has a place prepared for the woman who is Israel, and it says that they obey the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, end verse of chapter 12. So these people, many of them have believed upon Christ by the time you get to the middle of the tribulation period. And at the end of the tribulation period, you either have believed upon Christ or you're dead. You'll be judged as a Jewish person. Now, so the first thing I want to say there is that I think that this revival that we're talking about here is the beginning of the fulfillment of 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14. Again, read those chapters 5, 6 and 7 concerning the dedication of the temple. And really, here's the deal. When the people are repenting and when the people are being revived in their religion, you know what comes to them? They're remembering all of this. This is at the beginning, when Solomon dedicated the temple. And the whole thing was, Solomon was the son of David. And the promise of God, in fact, if you look at verse 17, God speaking to Solomon of chapter 7, verse 17. As for thee, if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, and to do according to all that I have commanded thee, and shalt observe my statutes and my judgment, which he did not, then will I establish the throne of thy kingdom, according as I have covenanted with David thy father, saying, there shall not fail thee a man to be ruler in Israel. What he's talking about? The son of David. And Solomon failed that, but as we part tonight, look at Luke chapter 1. I think this is a tremendous verse, and we overlook it. Now listen, part of the revival is not just that they're believing in the Lord, not just that they're going back to the old ways and they're believing the Bible and they're obeying the Bible by the sacrificial system, but they're also looking for the Son of David. Because the whole deal with Solomon and the dedication of the temple was, there shall not fail thee a man of the son of David to be a ruler in Israel. And I think part of the revival is now they're starting to look for the son of David who will come. Right from the beginning of the tribulation. So Luke chapter 1. Concerning Christ, verse 31, and behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Who's going to sit upon the throne of David? Who is the Son of David who's coming? Hosanna, blessed be thou, Son of David, who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the end of the tribulation period. But why are they looking? Why will they believe? Because God has already started something with the Feast of Trumpets. Does that make sense to you? Yes. Okay. Anybody got any major questions other than Brother Joel? Any burning question? Anything just pops into your mind? You say, I don't understand that. Okay. And so take your notes home and you can read over that again. All right. May the Lord bless you.